Hello and welcome to the two-man power trip of wrestling. I'm your host, JP, John Paz, and today the episode is a Terry Funk tribute episode. Obviously, he is the Texas Bronco, former NWA World Heavyweight Champion, WWE Hall of Famer, WWF Tag Team Champion, ECW Champion, USWA Champion, a legend in Japan. But of course, he is a god of wrestling. And for this tribute today, we're bringing in a very special guest, none other than Mr. John Snowden. John, welcome in. How you doing?
Oh, great. Thanks for having me, man.
So, of course, I said to myself, doing the Terry Funk tribute, we'll have in this episode an interview I did with Terry Funk. God, 2019, I think it was. So, I mean, we'll throw that on here at the end as well. But I know you've interviewed Terry a bunch, and you know more about Terry Funk than maybe anybody. I dare I say.
Well, I don't know if I'd go that far. There's always your Dave Meltzers and Terry's family, probably, and some of the other guys. But yeah, I have spent a lot of time thinking about and talking to Terry Funk. Going back a long time now, we met. I was working on a book called Death of the Territories, and a mutual friend connected me with Terry and said, I know that you watch Terry on ECW or WCW. He seems like a crazy person, but he's like nobody is smarter about wrestling than Terry Funk, and nobody knows more about the old territory system than Terry. He worked everywhere. He was a promoter. He knows the business inside and out. And so I got a chance to talk with Terry, and it was really enlightening. He was. Such a really smart and generous and kind guy. And so we talked for a long time. Um, just as a note, anyone who's looking for that book, it didn't end up being done by me. Tim Hornbaker ended up doing it when I ran into some health problems. But I still have the memories and the interviews with Terry. So, and then we recently touched base again. I'm working on a biography of Dusty Rhodes. And last year, I talked a long time with Terry, first about Dusty, but then just kind of about his life. Terry had moved into an assisted living facility by then, and I think, just to be honest with you, I think he was bored. So we did an interview, and then he called me the next day, and he called me the next day, and I was happy. If Terry Funk wants to talk about wrestling, I was here for it. So yeah, I've had the pleasure to really pick his brain about a lot of stuff. And when you look at his career, 1965 all the way up until like the end of the 20 teens, right? I don't remember when his last match is. Might have been like 2017, 2015, something crazy like
Yeah,
that.
2017. Yep.
I mean, the guy was doing it, and he told me that, like, if he thought he could sneak past his daughters, he would have done something last year. Like he had the business in his blood, and he loved wrestling, just like a lot of us do. So it was always cool to touch base with him.
That's awesome to have that relationship with him too, because obviously, you're probably a huge Funk fan as it is, and then for him to want to talk to you, I mean, that just makes it doubly sweet.
Well, so you've talked to Terry a little bit. So he was just a gracious and kind person, and it was easy to forget pretty quickly, like, this is the famous Terry Funk. He was just a super nice guy. And he's like one of those guys that when you're talking to him and interviewing him, he's talking to you too, right? He's asking you about yourself and your experiences, and like, he made it seem like, he made me feel like I was interesting, and I'm not interesting. He's just like that kind of guy. I think, as you saw when he passed away, and there was just this outpouring. Like, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say anything bad about Terry. He was just a super great human being, and so that as much as the wrestling can be the legacy that he carries on.
Man, got the chance to interview him 3 different times, and he was just super, super nice, super humble. I remember after one time he called me afterwards, he's like, "John, was that good? Everything okay? I sound okay? Everything good?" I'm like, "Oh, that was awesome. Thank you so much." He's, "All right, just wanna check." I'm like, "Oh my god," like, Terry Funk is asking me if it sounded okay? I'm like, I was like, "I should be asking him." It's like, You sure, this is okay of me interviewing you?" You know what I mean? Like, he's just what a, like, a I don't know, humble guy, just such a nice, sweetheart of a man.
Yeah, I think humble is a good term to use because I remember sometimes you would be talking to him and he'd be talking about his life and his career, and of course he did a number of great things, and he would be kind of embarrassed by it. He'd be like, "Oh, it sounds like I'm bragging now," like, and it would be something like he was really aware of, like he was just like such a normal. I hate to say normal when it comes to Terry Funk because he was obviously not normal in a lot of ways,
Yep.
but like as a person, he grew up, um, I think, with a lot of values that were of his time and maybe don't really exist anymore. So he didn't have the same kind of like self promotional element in his regular life that a lot of the celebrities do today.
The amazing thing about him, if you really look at his career, it's like you could almost break it off into like a pizza pie where you're just going into different quadrants of his career. It's like, okay, you have the NWA champion Funk from the 70s, which is like a completely different animal, similar but different animal than the All Japan when him and his brother start getting crazy, with some of those matches with Hanson and Brody and stuff. I mean, similar, but we're seeing a little bit of a different Funk. And then you look at NWA funk from the 80s when it's like a completely different funk, and then ECW funk, and then WWF Chainsaw Charlie funk, and then WCW. I mean, you get all these different pieces of pie, but he was always great, just amazing.
I mean, what's amazing about Terry's career when you start looking at it is like, so the part that most people listening to this are familiar with is all like, icing on top of the cake stuff. This is like he had long established probably two different Hall of Fame careers before anyone ever saw him wrestle Ric Flair in 1989, before he ever went to FMW to wrestle Anita, before there was ever such a thing as ECW. Terry Funk had already been 20 plus years in the business at the top. Like this is a guy who's been doing it since he was 21 years old. So he started. He was an offensive lineman for West Texas State. A really really good football player. I've looked at the old newspapers, and when you look at them, there was discussion in the papers about, hey, is Terry Funk going to go play in the NFL? Like he was, they do a lot of that with wrestling guys where they say like, he could have been a top football player and he was like a bench warmer, for some
Yep.
team, and it wasn't real, right? Terry was like a legitimate star, a star player. The very last game of his career, he was voted MVP, and they really thought that he might be a potential pro football player, but anybody who knew him knew that was not at all the case. The newspaper article I'm looking at it right now says Funk has been one of the key players on the team for the past 3 years and probably the most influential leader among the seniors. And he turned in one of his customary high quality blocking jobs. So like, this was a real football player, but anyone who knew him knew he was going to go and join his dad and his brother in wrestling in the Amarillo territory. And so like, less than 10 days after his last football game, he was in the ring for the first time against Sputnik Monroe, and in the main event, and it was just off to the races from there.
And I don't know if this is exactly true, but he had mentioned this, and I'm sure it's mentioned in other interviews before, but mentioned it to me that that's where the feud with him and Dusty really started because Dusty wasn't good enough to play, and that he was so much better at football than Dusty that Dusty was his backup. Don't know if that's true or not. Maybe you could confirm with that.
So yeah, Dusty would have been around at the same time. Dusty bounced around between a couple of colleges. A lot of people don't know this, but Dusty Rhodes' main uh, athletic claim to fame was actually as a baseball player. He was a successful baseball player at a number of Texas colleges, including West Texas State. And it's said that he was a walk-on the football team and rode the bench. I've not been able to find any actual record of that. So, but he was there. They definitely would have known each other at the time they crossed paths. So, whether or not that's what lit the feud between the Terry and Dusty, I think that's good wrestling lore. That's good storytelling.
And it's pretty funny. Dr. Tom, of course, Dr. Tom Pritchard was telling me one of the last times he saw Terry was visiting FCW. like, or was it NXT? No, I guess it would have been around the FCW time. Terry Funk came in and visited him. I was like, whoa, wait a second, wait a second. It's like they actually got along and they actually liked each other. He's like, yeah, why? You thought they hated each other? And I was like, hello, yes. I was like, when did they start getting along? This is crazy.
So yeah, they had a feud that lasted for what, almost 40 years, going back and forth in territories all over the country into their old age. They'd be there in the 2000s having matches against each other. It's kind of funny because, I did this interview with Terry all about Dusty, and he called me back the next day, and he was like, maybe we should cut all that and just print that I said Dusty was a no good egg sucking son of a gun, and and just don't use the interview. I'd hate to be saying anything nice about Dusty, and they kind of had that public relationship, right, where like they wanted to continue the feud for forever. That it was
Yep.
never going to die.
That is so funny. And Cody on SmackDown on the Terry Funk tribute, he was saying that you know he heard somebody yelling at him in the airport about yelling at his dad, but he changed it to egg sucking dog for some reason. In the story, but the story is an egg sucking dog. He was yelling, "Hey, fatso!" I know you know that funny story, where he kept yelling that to Dusty, and he apparently would do that to Dusty all the time in public. And he says, "No, no, no, is that so?" I said, and then of course Dusty would flip out and get mad. He's like, "Quit calling me fatso in public." And he's like, "I said, is that so?"
Yeah, Terry was a character, and um, nobody like lived life quite the way he did. There's all if you start digging into the shoot interviews and talk to some of the older guys in the business, like everybody has a Terry Funk story, and each one of them is like progressively wilder. Like he definitely lived life. There's no doubt about that.
Man, to me, if you look at that, like we're talking about Dusty Rhodes and that feud, everybody kind of has a story. I'm always thinking about the guys like his opponents, like the feuds. And when you look at certain guys, you're like, okay, like this guy had he had a couple of good feuds. Like, you just throw out like, all right, Steamboat Savage, who else did Steamboat have a good feud with? And you're like, okay, Steamboat Flair, Steamboat Root, Steamboat Jake, and then maybe maybe you kind of stop. With Terry Funk, if you start listing it, you're like, oh my God, you're still like, okay, Hanson, Brody, Jack Briscoe, Harley Race. If you go Onita, you can go Shane Douglas, Cactus Jack. Obviously, we're talking about Dusty Rhodes, but I feel like then you go Jerry Lawler, then you go Ric Flair, then Hulk Hogan when he was in the WWF. I mean, it's like endless amount of feuds that he had, and he could have good match with anybody. Pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and that's not even including like some of his great historical rivals, like the Sheik and Abdullah the Butcher, and and those kind of guys, and Giant Baba and Jumbo Saruta. Like Rock, he had great matches with Rocky Johnson, The Rock's father, Bill Watts. Just basically anyone who was anybody in wrestling, very likely had a feud with Terry Funk in the 1970s or 80s. He was that ubiquitous, and he was kind of one of these guys, like at the time, as I'm sure a lot of the listeners will know, like wrestling was broken up into distinct territories, right? And so you would wrestle only in Tennessee or only in West Texas, for the most part. But Terry and Dory Funk were a little bit different, because in 1969 Dory Funk Jr. became the NWA world champion, and he held that title for almost 4 years. So of course the world's champion works a crazy national schedule, going around to every territory and around the world, working matches. And what's interesting about Dory is that he had Terry. So often what would happen is that Terry would also be on kind of a national schedule. He'd go into a territory the week before Dory was set to defend the title. He would come in, be wild and crazy Terry Funk, feud with whoever the top babyface was in the territory. The babyface would beat Terry, and then it would give people hope that they could beat Dory too when he came the next week. And so he did that for almost 4 years. I talked to Jerry Briscoe, because who knows that experience better than Jerry? He did the same thing for his brother Jack. So he said that he and Terry would laugh. They called themselves the setup men, and basically they're like, he's glorified job guys, would go all around the country doing jobs, but he's like, we're the best paid job guys in the world. So that was Terry's life for a long time, is kind of like in support of his brother.
That is so true, and by the time he becomes champion, I know he holds the belt for, I think it was 424 days. I know it was well over a year, but it's one of those things where he kind of got tired of it, right? Like he's like, "Oh God, I just did this with my brother. I was kind of like the fall guy, and then Dory beats him. He looks like the hero. Then I'm the champion. I become champion. I actually beat Jack Briscoe, which my brother obviously had a major issue with. We won't go into that, but you know what I mean? It's one of those things where he's like, "All right, now I'm tired of being champion. I just tore it all around. Now I got to tour all around again, but now I'm the champ." Like he got tired of it, didn't he?
Yeah, so there was a lot going on, and I think that that's one of the things that when people talk about why things happen and why guys get a push or don't get a push, or a lot of times there's personal stuff going on in their lives, right? So in 1973, their father Dory Funk Sr., who was a legendary wrestler and promoter in West Texas, they promoted all these kind of small towns, Amarillo, Abilene, El Paso, Lubbock, Odessa, into Albuquerque, New Mexico, Colorado Springs. This huge part of kind of like Nowheresville in the West. He passed away in 1973. They had done the matches and they had gone back to Dory Sr.'s house, and he was wrestling around with the guys. Les Thornton was there, and he was saying Les Thornton was saying that nobody could get him in a front face lock and hold him, and Funk Senior said I can, and they're wrestling around, fooling around, and Dory Funk Senior ended up having a heart attack, and Terry was the one that drove him to the hospital, and of course he didn't make it, and so that was a huge tragedy in Terry and Dory Jr.'s life, and the other thing that it meant was not only did they lose their father, but they suddenly had inherited this wrestling territory. They were just Terry was 29 years old, I think, and he had acted like a big kid, right, his whole life, and suddenly he had this responsibility thrust on him, and he took it really seriously. But one of the things it meant was that he was working real hard. He was going to all the towns, and he ended up leaving and neglecting his wife a little bit more than she was comfortable with, and they ended up getting a divorce. Eventually she would take him back, but he kind of what he told me was that he felt like something similar was happening in 1975-76, whereas NWA world champion, he's on the road 300 plus days a year, and that's not an exaggeration. And he felt the same thing, like he felt his family slipping away a little bit, and so that played a big part of it. Him giving up the belt was in large part because he was worried about the rest of his life, and I think that when I hear him talk about that, that's really admirable to me, like someone that you know understands that there's more to life than just your job, right?
Yeah, especially if your wife is like, "Damn it, Terry, how come you're never home?" Well, I'm the NWA World Champion. I wrestle literally 300 days a year, and I'm in Japan. I'm here and there, but that could be really, really straining on any sort of relationship. I mean, that's just, oof. I can't even imagine being away from home that many days. It's nuts.
I know, and I mean, if you look at the history of wrestling, right, like it's just marriages don't survive wrestling for the most part, and so he had to make a choice, and he chose his family, and I respect that a heck of a lot.
When you look at him and his career and like what's going on, we were talking briefly about like how he basically had these different pies, right? I mean, NWA, then he goes to All Japan. He's a legend. He has that awesome promo where he quote unquote retires, forever, forever. I mean, that stuff. He just always had something that was just super memorable. Was that just innate, or is that him kind of thinking past, everybody else and just being smarter and really just thinking more about the business? Because I feel like everywhere he left, he basically left like an indelible mark. It's like, okay, I know I'm going to do this, and I'm gonna leave people hanging. Is that like a thing that was he did on purpose, or is that just kind of the way it happened?
I mean, I think he definitely had a gift for the business and for getting attention, and the way he would tell it. And I think this is real. A lot of times people like talk about the fans, and you can see they're snake oil salesmen, right? That it's a little bit BS when they're like, "Oh, I love the fans." Um, Terry really did love the fans. Like, I don't think I ever once talked to Terry Funk where he didn't talk about how like he felt like the heart of this business is making sure that every fan that is in the building feels like they got their money's worth. Like, that was his goal in life. That's what he felt his profession was. That's what wrestling was about, making money and making sure that the people that were there felt good about giving you their money. That was what Terry Funk was all about. So I think he was always looking for a way to entertain people and to show people things they hadn't seen before. Um, it's really interesting because I was working on this big story about the Funks, um, that hasn't come out yet. But one of the things was guys talking about what it was like to do wrestling matches with Terry Funk, and like you're saying, it's like every one of them, everything is different. Terry was a different kind of cat. Like, you take even the very best wrestlers in the world, um, Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan, like Bret Hart, whoever, you kind of know what they're going to do. Like, if you're wrestling them, you know what the experience is going to be like. You know kind of what moves they do, how they set up their matches, what it's going to be like. With Terry, guys didn't have any idea what he was going to do. He would just make it up as he went along. I remember talking to Steve Kern about Terry, and he had been working with Terry as a younger wrestler in Florida. And one time Terry came up and before the match and slapped him real hard in the face. And Steve didn't really know what to do. And Terry, when they got back after the match, Terry told him, "Hey, when I slap you in the face, you got to get mad and chase me around." And so the next match, next time, the next night, he slapped him in the face again. And Steve ended up chasing Terry all the way around the building. They went out of the building, ran around the arena, came back in the building, went under the ring. And Steve said they were kicking their feet up on the boards in the ring to make it look like they were like the Tasmanian devil, like fighting underneath the ring. And then they like came out on opposite sides. And he's just like, he didn't know any of that was going to happen. Like, you just wrestle Terry Funk and you just go with it. Terry was going to do something different, pretty much every night, and he would workshop stuff for sure. That guys say he would go to Puerto Rico and try out all kinds of crazy stuff there, and then bring it back to the States. That he was always looking for the next thing, and I think that's what a lot of the younger wrestlers really appreciated about Terry. When you listen to these podcasts, maybe not necessarily yours, but maybe sometimes yours, but the one with the older wrestlers where, so much of it is about like, oh, the business is no good today. Nobody knows how to work and they don't know this and they don't know that. And it's not like in my day. Terry didn't have any of that in him. Terry was always like, oh, this is what people like now. This is what's interesting now. Like, okay, let me figure this out. Okay, yeah, I'm 50 years old. I'm going to do a moonsault. Like, that was Terry Funk. Always learning, always trying to stay on what was current. And I think that's part of the reason that he had the longevity that he did, is that he was not afraid to change with the times and move forward. And that's pretty cool.
And it's great. God, a few years ago, I used to do a podcast with franchise Shane Douglas. He did a little bit of watch along with me. We're watching a Funk match of his in ECW. I was like, oh, this match is awesome. We're going through, and he's telling us, he's like, I had no idea he was going to do that. I had no idea. Like, he said, like, Funk was just like kind of all over the place, and you almost just had to be smart and adapt. I was like, well, Shane, I was like, that's great on you because you're kind of just going along with it. He goes, well, what else, am I supposed to do? Of course I got to go along with it. But I was just like, kind of laughing. I was like, wow, Funk really is like kind of like crazy. But when you actually watch, it was like, it wasn't anything where it wasn't enjoyable. It was like, wow, that actually made sense. And that was great. But Shane admitted, he's like, I had no idea he was going to do that. I didn't know where he was going.
I mean, so you think about that, right? So it's 1994, right? I think it's late 93. Funk wins the ECW championship from Sabu. And then, he's defending it in 94, Shane Douglas and Sabu in an hour-long match. He's been in the business almost 30 years at this point. Like, it's wild to think about. 1997 winning the ECW championship at the first pay-per-view Barely Legal. Like, this is an old man, and he's still doing it at at a very high level. It's remarkable. I mean, we see guys even today, with some of the benefits of medical technology and knowing more about diet and stretching and all kinds of interventions. Um, you see guys like Chris Jericho and some others wrestling into their 50s, but like when Terry was doing it 30 years ago, that was unheard of, right? Like nobody did that, and yet there he was, not just in these big matches, but in crazy matches, crazier matches than he had done as a young man. He's in Japan with Leatherface in a barbed wire board match, and he's got a glass match, and he's wrestling in an exploding ring with Mick Foley or Onita. Like, it's just like when you really stop and think about it, like Terry Funk is a marvel.
If you look at that too, it's like there was guys that would wrestle as they're older, but it was always like, this, you know what I mean? Like, the match is gonna stink, or that the match did stink, or it's not that great, or it's just, I don't know, one of those things where it's
Yeah,
just
well, it's
not
like it's just fun to see them. Like, I don't want to say anybody's name, but like, you see like a WWF star from the 80s or 90s on like an indie show today, right? And they're just gonna go out and they're gonna do a little bit of shtick, but it's not gonna be a real match, right? Like
right.
Terry was doing crazy matches. He's 44 years old, breaking his tailbone in WCW, continuing wrestling because he felt like he owed it to the company and the fans. Like you know, that's just insane, both loyalty and commitment and a little bit of being off kilter, right?
Yes, and I remember in '97, him versus Bret Hart, 50 years of funk, WrestleFest. Like, all right, he's older. Like, how good is this match going to be? And obviously, Bret's awesome, but it's like, all right, what does Funk have left in the tank? It's like, oh my God, that match was freaking great. You could put it up there with like one of Bret's best matches in '97, which is saying a lot. You know what I mean? That match is freaking awesome. So even he's older and he's still, you have to keep an eye on him because he's still great.
I mean, not only was that 1997 match great, I'll like one up you almost a decade later, 2006. He's in WWF, and there's a match at ECW One Night Stand 2006. It's Beulah, Terry Funk, and Tommy Dreamer against Edge, Lita, and Mick Foley. And like, this is one of the best hardcore matches I've ever seen in WWF. Like, not even exaggerating. It is like the the most amazing thing. And Terry Funk is in his 60s. Like, I just like there will never be another Terry Funk.
And it's funny, like he's basically there right in 2006 for like two shows. They wanted him for that WWE versus ECW thing, whatever that battle royal, but they wanted for that. They wanted for One Night Stand. That was it. But it was almost like, yes, he's older in 2006, but I was almost like they should just keep him. You know what I mean? Like have him on the roster. Like somehow he's still pretty good. And it's 2006. It's like, holy crap.
I mean, he was so good. And so I this is going to be in my story eventually, but I'll tell it now. Tommy Dreamer told me, um, so he was in that match, and he said the when they were doing a walkthrough or maybe the night before or on SmackDown or something, Terry had tripped coming to the ring, and Vince McMahon was telling everyone, hey, Terry's finally lost it. He doesn't have it anymore, and they had to kind of change the match around, because McMahon was afraid that Terry couldn't wrestle up to his normal standard, and they were hot about that, and they took that as a challenge, and Terry went out and killed it. They all went out and killed it in that match, and Terry's like lying there in the barbed wire, and he's covered in blood, and they come over to check on him, and he says, "I still got it." So that's a Terry Funk story.
That's awesome. He definitely did still have it, and I love like the animosity always with him and Vince. I mean, even when I interviewed him, God, I mean, a few years ago, he was talking about how he didn't really like Vince, and I don't know how much he's joking, how much he's serious, but obviously, when he tells Bruce Pritchard, and it's happened a few times, tell him the horse is sick. So he tells him that after he feuds with Hulk Hogan, right? Which is awesome feud, and they have a bunch of great matches, especially the Saturday Night's Main Event match, especially a match in Philly at the Prism, or I mean on the Prism Network at the Spectrum. But it's one of those things where he's just like, oh yeah, tell Vince, my horse is sick. And then 93, I guess, when Bruce wants to bring him in for Survivor Series, he goes, no, tell him I can't. My horse is sick. So then when Vince sees him years later at the Hall of Fame, he goes, hey, Terry, how's your horse feeling? Like, bring it up to him. Like, he knows he's full of shit, and Funk knows that he knows he's full of shit, but he's going to say it anyway. I mean, just what a weird and interesting relationship with those two guys.
Yeah, I mean, the way that Bruce Pritchard tells the story is like, Vince really enjoyed that. Um, Somebody telling him that, like this is a guy who, like, for his entire life, everyone in the business basically, bows and scrapes in front of him. So, I think he thought it was pretty funny that a guy would kind of just basically say, hey, I don't want what you have. I don't want to be here. And, two of the only guys who did that were Terry and Jack Briscoe, who, Jack had come in to work some tags, and he just decided, man, I can't do this anymore. And he went home to Tampa and never came back. And, Terry had a little bit of that in him where it's just like when he had the title, in WWF in 1985 and 1986, everybody was on an NWA World Champion schedule. Like every single one of those guys were working insane a number of matches. The
Yep.
company was just all over the country, and I think that was not what Terry wanted at that time in his life.
Yeah, he was kind of done with this working like how many days? I mean, this is absolutely nuts. And it didn't even matter because I mean, his one of his last matches, it's him and his brother against Hogan and like JYD. So it's not like he doesn't have a good place in the card, and he's probably making a ton of money working with Hulk.
Well, yeah, I
But
mean,
he just had enough.
he told me it never made better money, but it just wasn't worth what you had to do to get it. I think, and um, the matches, like the Hogan matches, it was huge. The Saturday Night's Main Event, and then it was on NBC, and he did a 10.4 rating. Like this was big. Like a lot of people were watching Terry Funk wrestle. Yeah, he had the great feud with JYD, but it just wasn't something that was sustainable for him, I think, at that point of his life.
I don't even remember the guy's name, but it was some, Twitter troll. These guys, honestly, you always question, like, did you guys ever watch wrestling? Do you know anything about wrestling? But they're like, oh, Terry Funk against Hogan. Because I said something, I love that feud. And he's like, come on, Funk was so old at that point. He was already NWA champion 10 years earlier. I was like, do you not realize Funk wrestled literally for 30 more years? Like, what are you talking about? Funk was old in 85. I was like, that feud is awesome, and their matches are awesome. I was like,
I know. So he was washed up in 85, and then what was he in 89 when he came in and, just like, one of the greatest things I've ever seen in my life was his feud with Ric Flair in
oh,
1989.
the best. Yep.
So
And it's funny because you're thinking you're like, okay, Flair Steamboat's the best ever. How can you top it? It's like, I don't know. Flair Funk is pretty amazing. It's like, holy crap.
yeah, so I mean, so Flair Steamboat is this legendary kind of artistic success, but the thing that no one wants to talk about is that it was a complete bomb at the box office. Like it was not what fans were wanting to see at that time for whatever reason. There's a lot you could say about that, which is, I think, is kind of, they really wanted to cheer Ric Flair,
Yeah,
and
the
so,
way they booked Steamboat was terrible. Yeah.
yeah. So it didn't really work. As wrestling matches, it was amazing. As a piece of business, it was not so great. Then Funk comes in, and the matches, I think, are nearly as good, if not better. And because of the dynamic where Terry is the heel, and Rick, the fans finally get to cheer for Rick, it does better business. And talking to Terry Funk, talking to Jeff Jarrett is a little bit this way too. It really opened my eyes talking to Terry, because we talk as fans, we talk mostly about the matches and how many stars were they, and this angle that we loved, solely based on just like personal preference, right? um, Terry didn't look at the business like that at all. um, Terry look it was a business. It was his business. He did it to make money, and the goal was to make money. So when a match didn't make money, like, he didn't remember it nearly as fondly as like some fans do. And the main one I remember like that is the 1981. He had this great series of matches with Jerry Lawler in the Memphis territory, and he was a great opponent for Lawler. But the match that was the most famous later on is the empty arena match. Um, I love it. Everybody loves it, and
Yeah.
and I
Awesome.
I remember like gushing about it to Terry, and he was just like, "Well, I mean, we didn't sell very many tickets on the next one." So the way Lawler and Terry were looking at it is like, okay, we're doing this one of these. We're doing two matches, right? The empty arena match, no money is coming in from that. It's an empty arena. There's
Yep.
no fans. So he's like, the next match that it builds to has to be huge. It has to pay for two matches, uh, and it didn't. And so they kind of considered it a bust. They didn't get their money's worth. They did a hard match, basically for free. That's how they look at it as professionals who are doing this for a living. Um, I try not to take that personally because I love it as a fan.
Yeah.
You
Yep.
know,
Wow.
ultimately
Interesting.
it doesn't matter what Terry thought about it that much. He thought about it from his perspective. I can only think about it from mine, which is as a consumer of the product, and I love that product.
To me, I didn't even like think about that. I mean, pretty smart of him, but wow, I always figured, oh, it must have done big business the following, you know what I mean, the go around, and it didn't. So he never really enjoyed it. Interesting. Wow, what a smart take on the business, and obviously the right take.
Yeah. So what was so cool about Terry is just like when you talk to him or even like go back and listen to his old shoot interviews, right? Like he always had his finger on the business. He was really prescient. Like he had a good idea of what was coming. Listen to him talk about WCW in the late 90s, and he's got his finger right on everything that's wrong, to the point of predicting how it was going to go under. Like, Terry was smart. He was smart about wrestling, and he that was hard earned, right? Like he had done it all. He had been a territorial star. He had been a national television star. He had been the biggest foreign star in Japan. He had been the NWA world champion. He had worked main event in WWE. He had been a promoter. Like very few people, he had been an announcer in WCW. Like very few people had worn as many hats as Terry Funk. And so it really gave him some good perspective to look at the business to like as a totality, and he saw it for what it was in a way that I think very few people do.
And I love, with WWF sticking around, you got to get that LJN, you got to get that figure, make it a couple hundred grand or whatever, whatever those guys made. I know obviously some guys made a lot less than that, but I mean, you got to be immortalized, get that figure, and then get out of there, right? I mean, got to do smart business up there.
Yeah, I mean, or you just take the money, the checks when they're there, and then you move on to other things. And like one of the things that that really made it impossible for him at that time to work that full WWF schedule was his interest in acting that he had picked up.
Mm,
Working
yep.
on the Paradise Alley film, then he was in Over the Top, and then he did Roadhouse, and he did a bunch of TV shows. Like he couldn't wrestle full time. He had found this acting thing, and the thing that was remarkable to him is that if he worked enough dates as an actor, he was eligible for health insurance, and that was super
Yes.
super important to his family. And so he had that commitment. So he did, I think, more acting than people realize. He's on like Wild Side and Quantum Leap and the show Tequila and Bonetti, and he did a lot of stuff. And he was like a choreographer of like stunts, and he did movies like that. He worked Rocky Five, that has the great street fight between
Tommy Gunn.
Stallone and Tommy Gunn, Rocky and Tommy Gunn at the end of the movie. That's a Terry Funk production. He was the fight choreographer for that. So like Terry had his foot in that too, and so he's really lived a lot of lives, man.
And Stallone must have really liked him. I mean, Paradise Alley, um, Over the Top, the Rocky Five stuff. I think he was part of Rambo 3, doing some stunts and stuff. So I feel like Stallone must have really
Yeah, I
liked
mean,
or maybe appreciated him in his acting. I know Stallone's a bit of a quote unquote mark as well.
yeah, I mean, he was also a consultant, I think, for when they were trying to do the wrestling stuff in Rocky Three. Terry had his hand in that, um, and I think that Stallone tweeted about Terry passing away. So yeah, he definitely had a long-standing relationship with him, and I think that's pretty cool, and I think Terry definitely was a very specific kind of character. Like if you saw him in a movie, you look at Terry Funk, you kind of know exactly what he's about. Um, Roadhouse more than anything, I think, is probably my favorite.
Oh yeah, it is funny over the top too. I remember that scene where Stallone like pushes him through the glass. He's like, "Excuse me," I said, "Mr. Cutler," and then Stallone pushes him through the glass. Just an awesome like stunt. He's like, "Wow, what the hell? Stallone's beating up Terry Funk. What the hell's going on here?"
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know. If I see Terry Funk in a movie, that's a movie I'm gonna watch for sure.
And if you look at like the ingeniousness of him, like, okay, I need the insurance for my family, and then he knows. I remember later on, he even said about WCW, he's like, I knew, it was fading fast, it's going downhill, but it was a gravy train, and I was getting paid from Time Warner till a certain period of time, and it was a decent amount of money, so he knew like kind of when to shut up and just take your money and or get your health insurance. Very smart, savvy guy.
Yeah, I mean, he had a couple of like post ECW runs, or one was I think even during ECW when he teamed with like the Stud Stable and Dusty Rhodes came back to team with Dustin. That,
Hmm.
that
Yep.
was a match that I remember fondly. And then in like near death WCW, Terry had that brief run as like the hardcore champion, and he and Dustin had a match on pay per view. Um, that I thought was surprisingly good, and Dustin remembers it as because Terry hit him with a raw chicken to
Oh
open
yeah.
the match,
Yep.
and he didn't know that was going to happen. Like so many of the guys that when you talk about Terry, they didn't know it was going to happen. He didn't know it was going to be a raw chicken, and so he remembers that match. But you know, if Terry was involved, it was going to be interesting. I think you have to give him that much at least.
If you look at it too, it's like he kind of spurred the walk behind her line because when Arn turns on him with Terry Funk, I mean, you knew something was going to happen there, but he did kind of spawn that great Dusty Rhodes walk behind her line to Dustin as well. So I know Dustin and Terry Funk do have a lot of history together.
Oh yeah, I mean for sure. One of the things Dustin told me is he grew up, you know, Terry and his old man were already bitter rivals, and for he told me when he was a kid for a long time, they were kayfabe back in those days. So the kids didn't necessarily know that, that he said they had some suspicions, right? But they didn't really know wrestling that it wasn't real. And he's like, I hated Terry Funk. I was scared of him and I hated him. Like he was always, beating the crap out of my dad. So it's everybody has a different perspective on it, and Dustin definitely had an interesting one, and then later on to be a peer in the ring with him, wrestling a great match, got to be pretty cool.
When you look at Terry Funk and that last run with WWE as far or just really WWF during the Attitude Era was Chainsaw Charlie. Did he like that gimmick? Did he mind doing that gimmick, or did he think it was silly?
It's hard to get like clear answers about that era. I never really had a good conversation with Terry about that time. You know, I thought maybe it had been his idea, but I'm not really sure. I know that all I can tell you is that from a fan's perspective, I thought it was pretty great. I thought they did some good work, and they did a lot, I think, to help the New Age Outlaws get over. So and there's little things that Terry did that I think just like that very few people could have done. Like when Mick Foley and the Undertaker had the Hell in the Cell match, and no one knows if uh, Mick is okay. Right, he's fallen down into the ring unexpectedly, taking this terrible bump. And if you remember, I haven't seen it in a while, but Terry comes in and he's trying to buy Foley some time, and he takes a choke slam from the Undertaker, and his shoes go flying off. You know,
Yes.
that's that's just like a Terry Funk thing, and then it adds something to the match. But the real reason he did that is so that Mick would have some more time to get it together, and that's veteran presence, and who had it better than Terry Funk?
Man, it's just unbelievable too. Because if you just look at like I don't know that run, it's just funny because he's like Chainsaw Charlie. Yes, they're having their big WrestleMania moment, him and Cactus, but they are kind of like helping the Outlaws get over. They're helping Undertaker get over a little bit, although I mean he's over anyway. But I mean helping Undertaker a bit, but really kind of helping Mick too, because if you remember in '98, they had that awesome match on Raw where basically Foley's kind of like, hey. Um, when we were getting beat up by the Outlaws and we lost the tag titles in that cage match, you guys were cheering for Steve Austin, F you guys. So then they had that no holds bar, that falls count anywhere match, and Foley beats him. But it's a long match, especially in '98 when like Russo's writing Raw and everything is 4 minutes or two, every match is short. I mean, they have a
Right.
really long, awesome match. And basically that's kind of the build up to Dude Love coming in and Dude Love versus Austin and Foley being cemented as a main event player. So it's funny, wouldn't think so, but in '98, him beating Funk and then having that long match and awesome match kind of, reinvigorated Foley. It put him back on the map as a main eventer.
Yeah, I mean, so and I think he devoted a lot of time in the 1990s to help Mick, who he had taken a real liking to. You know, they did stuff in ECW, and of course, then the King of the Death Matches stuff, '95 Kawasaki Stadium, where they met in this the no rope barbed wire exploding ring match. Uh, you know, a lot of people saw that tape. That was one that tape traders looked for a long time. Mick just covered in blood, and it was quite a spectacle. And Terry gave a lot of himself uh, for that. And then they had some complicated times, like the famous ECW incident where the towel had caught on fire and it was on Foley's chair and it flew off and landed on Terry, and Terry caught on fire. Um, like their relationship was probably a little strained then. That was one of the few times people can remember Terry being really mad. He had second-degree burns all over his body from catching on fire there, and someone sued the promotion. It was a big mess, but he and Foley had been through a lot together, so I'm sure he was happy to do anything he could to push him up to that next level.
When you look at just like Funk and just looking at his career, it's like he can help guys get to the next level. He can, generate money with guys. He can come in and feud with Flair and be the main event, even though, hey, you were just in Hollywood, pal. You're just an announcer. Like there's something about him. I mean, you could say, I always say about certain guys, like this guy's like the perfect pro wrestler. Like he could be, helping a guy along. He could be the main event, or he could be an awesome promo guy. Like to me, he is kind of like that perfect wrestler, right? I mean, he could kind of just do anything and fill in anywhere that you needed him to be. Like he was just really an announcer in '89 when he's with Flair, and then Flair kind of says that, and then Funk beats him up, and all of a sudden we're invested, we're in, we're like, okay, he's the main eventer now. He's the lead heel.
Well, part of it is because he was so good at convincing people that he was crazy. Like there's that Flair saying that stuff, and he's like, "Oh, Terry, I respect you a lot, but you're gonna, you have to earn it. You're just an announcer." Like you can see it in Terry's eyes. Like it's like you're like, "Oh no, something's about to happen here," and he was people really bought into that. Yeah, I remember Eddie Kingston telling me he believed that Terry was crazy. And probably Terry was a little crazy, and that was part of what made it work so well. And I think it's really interesting that we have kind of identified as a group, wrestling fans, hardcore wrestling fans especially, have identified Terry as one of the best wrestlers of all time, if not the best wrestler of all time. That's kind of the popular consensus now. I think it's like important to remember, and I remember talking to Dory Jr. about this for a while. Um, for much of his career, that was not the case. Like Terry was very much Dory Jr.'s brother. He was Junior's brother. Dory Funk Jr. was considered the great wrestler. And, of course, he was a great wrestler, but, he didn't have quite the longevity Terry did in the national promotions. So, in the 70s, like Dory was the guy. Everyone considered him the man. When Terry was world champion, there was a lot of criticism of him, from Bill Watts and others that, he didn't quite fit the right mold as the NWA champion. So it's only in the second half of their careers in their lives that people have decided that Terry was the great Funk brother for the first 15 years of their career. Dory was most definitely uh, considered one notch above, I think, for the most part. So it's been an interesting transition as Terry continued to grow and change as a wrestler, and perceptions changed a little.
Interesting too, because when I asked Terry, like the generic question, "Hey, give me some favorite matches," or like, some of your favorite times in the ring, he said like his favorite times were when he was teaming with his dad and his brother. So did he think that his dad and his brother were like better than him, or was that just like a nostalgia kind of family, him kind of loving the moment, so to speak, or did he actually think that like those were his better parts almost?
So it's kind of interesting because we had to rely a lot on word of mouth about Dory Senior. Like a lot of videotape does not exist on his career. You talk to Jerry Briscoe and some other guys. I remember Fred Curry and some others had seen him wrestle, and he reminded them a lot of Terry. He looked a lot like Terry. If you look at them together, like Terry and his father were spitting images, but you know, Dory Senior had that craziness to him. The Texas death matches, barbed wire matches. They were doing those matches in the 1950s, so they had a hardcore element. But Dory Senior had been a champion amateur wrestler too, so he had a shooter element to him as well. So he was maybe like a combination of the two brothers. Dory Senior was an interesting guy. That was when Terry was a kid, the wrestling business was very different. Took it very seriously. I remember Junior told me that anytime someone suggested to Dory Senior that wrestling was fake, it was either going to be a fight or he would shoot a double leg, take him down, hold him down, and ask the guy, "Does that seem fake to you?" Like, so he grew up in a time where people were really serious about wrestling, and so I think that's something interesting that informed the perspective of both Dory Jr. and Terry. They had seen what wrestling was like, um, you know, back in the day when the fans really were crazy. Everyone tells stories about riots and fans attacking people, and maybe that happened occasionally in the 80s. In the 1940s and 50s in Texas, that really was happening, and that was the kind of wrestling that they grew up with.
When you look at it, do you think that Terry would say like, "Oh, Dory's the best," or would he say, "I was the best"? You know what I mean? Like, who would he say, or would he say somebody else?
Yeah, I don't know. Like they had a lot of admiration. I definitely Terry would not say he was the best. He just did not have that gene in him. You could tell him you thought he was the best. He would never say that. Both Terry and Dory admired Gene Kiniski a lot. They admired Harley Race a lot. They admired Baba a lot. Um, who's the best? I would guess that Terry would tell you whoever was drawing the most money was the best. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if wrestlers necessarily think about it quite the same way that we do. I know I have a lot of favorite Terry matches. Um, it'd be hard to get him to pick one out. What are some of the ones that you like?
I do love the Hogan series. I know people say obviously I'm a huge Hogan mark, but I do love the two Hogan matches, that night's main event and the Prism Network. I love the Flair series. I actually, besides New York Knockout, I think that match is awesome. But I love the Great American Bash one. I mean, just it's because it's one of those things where the feud's going to continue. But I love that that there was kind of like no conclusion to it. Um, Man, there's a bunch. There's a Steamboat match that I love. The Lawler match. I love even though he doesn't. Um, the Empty Arena match. Um, I love. There's a couple Shane Douglas matches I really like. For whatever reason, I do like that tag match at Havoc '89 when it's Flair and Sting against him and Muda. It's just like a unique kind of weird cage and just a unique match. But for some reason, I just love that match. The Bret Hart match at WrestleFest, I love. There's a lot, and I mean, I'm naming like 5 or 6 different opponents here. I mean, he could have a good match with almost anybody, but there's a lot of good like matches, and I love that match on Raw when he fights Mick Foley. So there's a bunch of them. How about you? Where would you go with it?
So I like some of the older stuff, and I'm going to mention three just to draw people's attention to. They might not have seen them, and because these are matches from the '70s, all of them, and so they wrestled at a different pace maybe than we're used to. So that's just a caveat. You kind of have to put yourself in that time and place, right? Spots aren't going to come fast and furious the way they do today, but one of them is June 17th, 1976, Terry Funk versus Jumbo Tsuruta. Best 2 or 3 falls for the NWA World's Championship. Um, that is a fantastic NWA World Championship match. Um, then there's a match that we only all got to see recently. The NWA on like kind of unearthed a bunch of footage from the old Houston promotion, the Paul Bosch Houston promotion. It's one of the few groups that the footage is not owned by WWF, and they were releasing a lot of matches. So one of them was a match between Harley Race and Terry Funk, uh, July 1st, 1977, from Houston. That's one of the great finds in the last 20 years as far as wrestling matches goes. Just a classic match no one had seen before, no one had probably seen since 1977, and it comes out in this perfect video quality. That's a great match. I think you can find that on YouTube. And then finally, the match that I absolutely love. They had several of them, but the best one I think was December 13th, 1979. Abdullah the Butcher and the Sheik versus Dory Funk Jr. and Terry Funk. Um, just an epic tag team match. And one of the things that when you're watching the Funks in this era in Japan, um, you will be amazed at the reception they receive from the fans. Traditionally, foreign wrestlers are the heels, Japanese are the babyface. That's just kind of how wrestling was set up in Japan. Coming out of World War II, of course, there was a lot of animus between the two countries. So, we were the bad guys, they were the good guys. Just like when they came over here, they were the bad guys, we were the good guys. That was not true for the Funks. The Japanese fans came to respect them so much that Dory Funk Jr. and Terry Funk were baby faces in Japan to a level that you won't even believe if you watch this match. Just watch the entrance. It almost feels like a worship service for Dory and Terry when they come out in this match. That's how much the Japanese fans love them. And then once the match starts, it's just bonkers, wild stuff. Butcher and the Sheik, Funk and the Funks. Like, you don't get any better than that. That's like the apex of wrestling for me. Just incredible.
Man, those matches are just awesome. Obviously, the matches you the matches you mentioned are freaking awesome. The matches that I mentioned, obviously, I love and I think they're great. But that's just like the tip of the iceberg with this guy. I mean, geez, I mean, we could probably go on and on forever. I think Phil Schneider, our buddy, there was saying somebody had a YouTube compilation of like 300 matches or something. I thought he said. I was like, oh my god.
Oh man, I mean, I totally believe it. I mean, it's Terry Funk, and he's doing something interesting. He had all those great matches in the '70s. He had the great series with Flair, and of course, everyone. We all love the ECW, but then there's also that period in the early '80s when All Japan was going heavy, hot and heavy against New Japan Pro Wrestling, and you know you could do a whole podcast on it, but like New Japan stole Abdullah the Butcher, and so the Funks work secretly behind the scenes, and out of nowhere, um, here comes Stan Hansen into All Japan Pro Wrestling. Nobody knew he was coming. Like that's a thing we didn't talk about at all, really. Dory and Terry were the lieutenants to Giant Baba's for All Japan Pro Wrestling, basically running the foreigners and helping book and train wrestlers like Jumbo Tsuruta and Onita and all these other guys. Like that's a whole nother Hall of Fame career, right? Just All Japan. That's
Yep.
a Hall of Fame career. So there's no period of his career that you can look to and not find a great Terry Funk match. You and I are working on this 1990s wrestling almanac spoiler, like, we haven't really talked about it, but there's matches in 90 and 91 before ECW where Terry is working the independents, matches with Jerry Lawler that I'll put up with anything that's happening in early 90s on the independent scene. Like, you put Terry Funk down anywhere on the planet, there's going to be a great match. We hardly mentioned Puerto Rico. Whole different Hall of Fame career in Puerto Rico. Like Terry Funk is just, if he's in a wrestling ring, magic is happening.
And didn't even mention it, but Eddie Gilbert and that feud that they had, and they wrestled everywhere. And obviously Philly was a big part of that too. But man, like, talk about like having good matches where you don't think they're going to have good matches, or like, it's a throwaway. Those two would have awesome matches everywhere.
Yeah, I mean that's that same time period. So like, that's when Terry was just really tearing it up on the independent scene, and he had those matches with Eddie. I remember like a Texas death match, and they had an I Quit match, and they had like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre match. I'm maybe remembering this wrong, but I do remember uh, all that stuff. He had the barbed wire match with Sabu in ECW. Like, we could just spend an hour listing Terry Funk matches, and
Yeah.
like, you're going to land on a bunch of great ones.
And I know you love the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from AEW, I'm sure. I knew you love that match.
I like the idea of it. Sure. I don't want to get in trouble by criticizing anybody, but
Yeah, yeah, you can't. No, you can't. No, no,
not in today's world, right? But
no, no, no.
definitely Terry Funk, if he was in it, you know, he had the whole second run in Japan with Onita and FMW. Only kind of briefly talked about that, but one of the best wrestling spectacles I've ever seen in my entire life was '93. I think it's May '93, right? The no rope exploding barbed wire time bomb death match between Onita and Terry Funk. And that's one of my all time favorite matches. I probably should have mentioned that one. That's the fourth anniversary of the FMW promotion in Japan. They ran Kawasaki Stadium, tens of thousands of people coming to see Terry Funk against Onita. And Onita had been, one of Terry's many proteges, a guy that they All Japan sent over as a very young man to America, barely spoke any English, wasn't really booked anywhere, showed up at Terry's house. Terry gave him an old card they had on the ranch, and helped him get booked with Eddie Graham in Florida, and then he went to Tennessee, and so he had been, Terry Funk was his idol. And then they had this match together, this incredibly violent match that Onita won. And then the finish is the ring is going to explode, and then the time is counting down, and Terry is laying in the ring and he can't get up, and Onita comes back into the ring, covers Terry's body with his own, and takes the brunt of the explosion because he loves Terry Funk that much and admires him as his elder and as his mentor. I mean, God, doesn't get more powerful than that as
Yeah, it's
as
awesome.
as pro wrestling, like just as a piece of art. Like I put that, like you could put that in the Louvre, like that's true wrestling artistry, and you know that's what Terry Funk delivered, man.
Terry Funk, a god of wrestling. But as we wind it down, we head towards the finish here. What's the legacy of Terry Funk? How would you kind of sum that up?
Yeah, I thought it was so sad when we talked to Terry, and he was saying that he didn't think that he had much of a legacy, um, that he would be forgotten. And when you talk to him, he only has his own perspective, right? So a lot of the guys that he had admired from the 50s and 60s when he was a young man, nobody remembers them anymore. And so, he kind of naturally thought that's what would happen to him, is that like time would pass, and people would forget. That's just the nature of time. But I think it's different now because we have these things are preserved. Terry's career is preserved in a way that Gene Kaninsky's career wasn't, the way that Frank Gotcha's career wasn't, Jim Lundis was not. We don't have all those memories that we can go back and look at. Terry's different. all these guys are now. Like, that's why nostalgia is such a big thing in wrestling, because um, we can all go back and watch it. And so I think people will be watching and learning from Terry for a very long time. Like, it's been more than 50 years since he started, and you can still watch and learn from him. You can watch his matches from 40 years ago, and there's still very few people, if anyone, working at that level right now. So I think that Terry's legend may even grow with time as people continue to admire what he's done, um, hear all the tributes to him, and go back and share all these matches. Like, I think that we'll be talking about this stuff in 20 years, and then our kids maybe will even be talking about it in 50 years. That's my hope, at least, that that Terry is immortal. Not
Terry
to
Funk.
steal, not to steal from Hulk Hogan. Sorry.
Right. Terry Funk forever. He is definitely a god of wrestling to me. If people said Mount Rushmore or a goat or anything like that, I'm not going to argue. Obviously, he's got to be considered. To me, you want to say perfect wrestler, he has to be considered that as well. Terry Funk, an absolute god, right? You can't deny that.
Forever.
Now, where can everybody find you, social media and otherwise?
Well, at my house, but please don't come. I
Yeah.
am on social media. I guess I'm on Twitter at Je Snowden, I think is my Twitter name. I don't do as much social mediaing as I used to, and I haven't done as much writing. I've been writing some stuff for the Ringer, but I'm mostly concentrating on some book projects. So hopefully in a few months I'll have much more to tell people about where to find me, and some projects to kind of promote. But right now, um, I'm in the production process, not the sales process.
Nice. All right, John, thank you so much for all the time. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And like you said, forever. Terry Funk forever.